This is the BioCentury Show. Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds, returning in 2025 to Chicago, Illinois this June and in Cambridge, UK this September. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore groundbreaking advancements in early-stage R&D and dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Learn more at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
Welcome to the BioCentury Show. I'm Jeff Cranmer, Executive Editor here at BioCentury, and joining me today is Jorge Santos Da Silva. He's the CEO of Moonlake Immunotherapeutics. The company is a Swiss biotech that uses nanobody technology to develop therapies for immunologic diseases. Jorge founded the company in 2021. He took the company public on NASDAQ in 2022 and has guided the company's lead asset, sonelokimab, also known as SLK, into phase 3 testing this year. Moonlake believes the product has what it takes to become a pipeline in a product for inflammatory diseases. Jorge, welcome to the BioCentury Show.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and the BioCentury team for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Excellent. Well, let's start with the evolving landscape of Moonlake's lead indication. It's a tricky one to say, but I'll give it a shot. Hidradenitis suppurativa, hereafter known as HS. A few years ago, HS was on no one's radar. Jorge, I'd like to hear from you as one of the leaders in this space, how the landscape has shifted over the past few years in terms of things like endpoints and, importantly, competition.
Absolutely, Jeff. Let me maybe even take one step further back and talk about the broader market and how it has evolved over the last years. Also because it relates very deeply to the story of Moonlake and why the company was founded and why we chose sonelokimab or SLK as an asset to build a company around. HS is a devastating disease. We now know that it's impacting or has a prevalence that probably is well north of 2% of the world's population, and that's true for geographies like the United States or Europe. So if you take a step back, a really prevalent disease, and we knew that this was the case, but as it so often happens with diseases where patients are lost in healthcare systems, diagnostics takes many, many years, and where there are no drugs, no pharmaceuticals to really treat and address the disease, it often stays on the wings, a little bit under the cover, and hardly anybody speaks of it. I would like our team to take a little bit of credit for bringing the disease into the forefront. And again, I think you would agree, Jeff, any disease that has prevalences of this order should definitely be in the crosshairs of a lot of people. But I think that's what we've achieved to do or contributed to in the last 4 years since we were just celebrating 4 years this week, by the way. But ever since day one, it's been about putting HS as one of our indications right in the middle of the stage. The disease is also not just very prevalent, but it's also devastating for patients. This is a dermatology inflammation that affects different layers of your skin, but that causes lesions that accumulate over time, often irreversible, require surgery, but also lead patients to lead very, very isolated lives. It's very diminishing in your ability to move, but also in your ability to work and your ability to interact with others. And one of the hallmarks of the disease is lesions that leave pus to come out of your skin. And if that's happening every day, all day, then as you can imagine, Jeff, that's a very, very difficult situation to live with. So I think what has happened in the last 4 years is we went from nobody really knowing the disease to now being an established fact. And I think you can see that in bank reports, analyst conversations, investor conversations, but also to your point of competition, how much drugs now are being tried in HS. It really shows you that the needle has moved. Just to give you a sense, diagnosed, treated, and coded patients in the United States, there's 2.5 million individuals, right? So about 80,000 of this, 3%, get treated with biologics. And the biologics so far have really not allowed you to aspire to a lot of improvement or to a lot of change in your life. So huge need, a full penetration market. It's not really about competing for a few patients. It's really about going out there in the next few years and treating as many patients as possible, bringing as many patients as possible to the healthcare system.
Let me jump in there.
Sorry.
We're talking a little bit about competition. It does sound competitive. It does sound like there's a lot of patients to reach out to who haven't been served yet, but there's a lot of companies going after this now. How is your asset standing out from those others?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons why we stand out. First of all, Jeff, a lot of people tried, a lot of people are trying, but the results largely continue to be very underwhelming. Just last week, we had another 2 assets from a very large pharmaceutical company from Sanofi that either didn't really show any results or showed very poor results in terms of really moving the needle. So lots of patients, lots of people trying, but at the end of the day, you have Humira or adalimumab as the first approved therapy a few years ago, but very limited impact, and it only helps half of the patients, and that effect typically runs out after a year. We're talking about a chronic life disease, so of course a year doesn't really help that much. Cosentyx was from Novartis was approved at the end of 23, had a fantastic launch, a first grade year, a huge contributor to what is arguably one of Novartis's biggest assets. But again, very limited efficacy. I think the two assets that really stand out is Bimzelx or bimekizumab from UCB and sonelokimab. Granted, bimekizumab as launched at the end of 24, phase 3s are done, product is approved, etc. We're just on the cusp of reaching primary endpoint in phase 3. But by all clinical measures, these are the 2 assets that really look more promising. Now,
that's interesting.
Between us and bimekizumab, there's some differences as well, which we can talk about. But I believe that this MOA, the IL-17 A and F inhibition, which these 2 molecules share, this is really the leading mechanism of action for HS.
What's the advantage of that mechanism?
It's IL-17 is a pathway that is involved in many different types of inflammations in different tissues, be it the skin or the joint or the kidney or others. It's a universal, if you will, inflammation pathway. And the interesting thing is that there were molecules that could inhibit one of the halves of this pathway, IL-17A, but not the other, right? So what us and bimekizumab could bring to the market, in the case of bimekizumab and soon for us, is the ability not only to inhibit A, but with much higher affinity, but also F with very high affinity. In our case, we actually inhibit both with equal very high affinity, which is a bit of a differentiator also to bimekizumab. But really, this is the pathway, and we know it's dominant in these diseases, and it's also dominant in other diseases, in dermatology, rheumatology, diseases we are pursuing. So not only potential in HS, but potential more broadly.
Excellent. You mentioned the market opportunity. I know you just had your Capital Markets Day, and in the presentation, the estimate for the market was that it would grow to 10 to 15 billion in 10 years. How does it get there?
Well, actually, Jeff, is actually quite simple. If you simply take 2.5 million patients, if you take the average price that is practiced for HS patients, or even a little bit below if you want, and you just assume a penetration of biologics, which is obviously the solution for these autoimmune diseases, you very rapidly get to 15 billion and even more. I think this is one of those where there's always, of course, we always have to strike a balance between the market potential and the burden it brings to the healthcare system. But here, I think there's true value, because if you think that patients suffer from this horrible disease I described for all their lives, and a lot of their lives is spent in the emergency room or on surgeries or on physiotherapy to recover from surgery, always with very strong painkillers, antibiotics, etc., you can imagine that drugs are really probably more needed here than even in other cases. But the sheer size of it sustains a market of that size relatively easy.
Jorge, I'm curious to hear your take about the progress of precision immunology. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think about a ballpark 60-ish% of HS patients get a good response to SLK. I may be off there. You can correct me if I am. Are you doing the work to figure out why some respond and not others, and how to predict that?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, Jeff. So I think your quote is right, depending obviously of the level of score that you look at. It can be 60, it can be more, also depending on the time point. I think what we really like to look at here is treatment effects. So differences between placebo responses, which you always have in these complicated diseases, where also the treatment and the diagnostic are complicated, and those treated with drugs, right? So the one that we really like to reflect is high score 75. We don't need to go into the details, but it's a 75% improvement in the score that describes the clinical situation of patients with HS, or one of the scores. It's the very first time, Jeff, that a company has ever used that as a primary endpoint. Typically, all the other competitors I told you about, they use a 50% improvement as a bar. Right. We use a 75. And on that, so far the data suggests almost a third of the patients get to that level, which for patients that had no solution is really revolutionary in my mind. There are a lot of patients that don't respond, but if you, of course, keep treatment over time, these numbers, the 1/3 goes higher and higher, and that's what we're testing in our clinical trials. And others have shown for the similar pathways that you can get to those 60, etc. Now, Jeff, I think from a pragmatic perspective, that is such a tectonic shift in what is possible that I would consider that in the next few years to be an immense success that probably even patients were not expecting, right? Now, there's, of course, always a percentage of patients that don't really respond. I'm not sure that it's necessarily about precision immunotherapy. In a lot of these cases, these diseases are, you say that a patient has HS because as a dermatologist, you look at the patient, right? You see a manifestation. But sometimes these manifestations could be caused by different disease subtypes where other pathways are involved, right? And I think this is going to be much more a question of combinations, finding different pathways, seeing how we can balance it. In our case, we're already balancing two, IL-17A and IL-17F. Then it is going to be a necessary precision around, for those listening, precision around CAR-Ts or genetic therapy. I think it's probably going to be more about finding great drugs like SLK and sometimes combining them rather than anything else.
Excellent. Well, SLK helped put HS on the map, or back on the map. I'm curious, in your mind, what will be the next HS in I&I?
I think it's going to be SLK for a while.
No, I mean, not just SLK, but like after HS, are there other big I&I indications that you think have yet to be, that are sort of lying out there off the radar that could become the next HS in I&I?
Absolutely, Jeff. That's a very good question, and some of it we're pursuing, and other things we still have in the drawer. So the IL-17A and F inhibition or inflammation, depending on how you want to see it, is really common to a lot of diseases. We, in our recent Capital Markets Day, we actually introduced interim data already for a second dermatology indication, and I'm going to continue with the complicated names, Jeff. Palmoplantar pustulosis, let's say PPP. Again, a disease that has no drugs approved in the US or Europe, no drugs, affects thousands and thousands. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people already today in the United States. but again, no solution. And we've shown interim data that I think is really, really, really spectacular. There's many of these. We have a list of about 20 to 25 indications that we would like to go after. Now, as a small biotech, you're always a bit limited, but we have HS, we have PPP on the derm side. We're also already running the phase 3 for psoriatic arthritis on the rheumatology side. Mm-hmm. And we also have axial spondyloarthritis running on a trial. So we already have 4, but we have a long list that we could go after. And I truly believe that when I call SLK a pipeline in a product, mm-hmm. that's exactly what it is. I think the next few years we'll see us in this MOA, and especially the nanobody technology being used in this type of indications.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned as a small biotech, I mean, do you feel like you can't go after as much as you'd like, and therefore you feel compelled maybe to partner? And in a little ways, when I think of Moonlake, I also think of another European standout biotech, Argenx, which has this pipeline and a product and really is doing it on its own. How do you how do you seize all the opportunities that are out there?
I think, Jeff, the answer to that is you don't. Very happy to be associated with a prestigious company like Argenx. Hopefully we have some of that success, would be great. But I think this is really about making choices, right? Even in a situation where we had infinite money, then you don't have infinite people. Mm-hmm. And you don't have an infinite talent. And then you don't have an infinite management capacity to make sure the ship stays straight, going fast to the objective. So you always have to make choices. Obviously, we have to think very carefully about access and cash, diluting shareholders and all, and managing this team. So we're probably a little bit more constrained than, say, a large pharma. But in any case, we wouldn't be able to go after all the indications. In better market conditions, with a little bit more understanding about what are the good and bad opportunities in biotech, and we might get to that topic later, there probably could be more money for great assets rather than spread across the industry. That would probably give us a little bit more ability to go after diseases that truly impact people and can really change the world. But I think that's the line that we have to walk, especially then if we want to think, okay, we're going to bring this to the market, we're going to commercialize this product. You and I are great football fans, seeing it on the breaks of the Super Bowl. All these things cost money, right? So we also have to use some of our financial firepower to commercialize, not just to develop. So it's these constant choices that you have to make as a small biotech like us.
Excellent. And for the record, Jorge is a fan of the legendary Green Bay Packers. So much respect there.
Now you split the audience.
They've always given my Philadelphia Eagles fits, just not last year. All right, we're going to go to a quick break, and then we're going to come back and talk a little bit about Jorge's plans for manufacturing build out, leadership, and dealing with this pesky turmoil in the biotech markets.
Grand Rounds. BioCentury's R&D conference will return in 2025 to the US and Europe to debate key bottlenecks in translation and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us in Chicago, Illinois this June for the second BioCentury Grand Rounds US, and in Cambridge, UK this September for the inaugural Grand Rounds Europe. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
We're back on the BioCentury Show with Jorge Santos Da Silva, founder and CEO of Swiss biotech Moonlake Immunotherapeutics. George, we talked a lot about the market opportunity, about how your lead asset, SLK, is standing out. You're now in phase 3 of some big readouts ahead. Obviously, regulatory applications down the pipe. I believe you want to, hopefully, if everything goes to plan, launch in a couple of years. How are you thinking about the next steps for the company? The choices that you're making in terms of building out manufacturing, for example?
Well, that's we're thinking about a lot of topics, but obviously that's a big one. That's also a very very hot one right now with all the potential changes that are being discussed, especially with regards to the U.S. We're going to do a lot of investments in additional trials, in the commercial buildup, in the regulatory submissions, as you mentioned, and indeed also in terms of our supply chain. I have to say, Jeff, that obviously there's a lot of noise right now. I always find it a little bit interesting that there's so much noise when so very little is actually changing in reality. But I think that companies like ours, biotechs that are just about to get commercial, are actually in a very, very good position, right? I think the market is quite hysterical, but we're actually in very good positions because oftentimes, and we're no exception, all the decisions regarding manufacturing or things that could more broadly impact tariffs, etc., are decisions that are all in front of us. I can give you the example of our company. We already have drug substance manufacturing. We already have drug product filling. We already put things in injectors, in boxes, ship it around the world for clinical trials. So all is working. And in our case, we have quite a mature supply chain that could take us into year 2 or 3 of the market. But even us, we will have to make the next investments in our second sourcing. Choose another factory, which you need for redundancy and in business continuity reasons, etc. So for us, we're in this very good position where, do we build more capacity in Europe, say in Austria or in Belgium, which are the places we like for our technology? Or do we invest in California or in the US? All our partners have capacity in the United States. We have the money and the time to make those investments. So if I'm actually thinking about the turmoil that exists right now, I would argue that companies like Moonlake are in probably the most comfortable position because we were going to spend the money anyway. Mm-hmm. We have not set up transfer pricing and all the things that obviously also impact the US from a tax perspective. All of that is to be said for a company like us, right? So I think we're in a very comfortable position with all these topics that cause so much turmoil these days.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about that. Like, how do you think through those choices?
I mean, it's really a question of first understanding what is being really required. As I said at the beginning or in the previous answer, right now nothing has really changed. There's a lot of conversation, a lot of ideas, but nothing has really changed.
That's strangely comforting from where I sit.
maybe the advantages of seeing the US from a little bit more distance. But the way we take those decisions is obviously when is the latest time point there. For example, we need to make that go-no-go decision to spend the next $150 million on additional capacity to manufacture, right? All of those will now, and we compare that with the Section 232 investigation that is being driven by the White House and the Bureau of Security and Industry to figure out if and how tariffs should be applied. Once we have that, we realize, okay, do we need to put capacity in the US or not? If the answer is yes, we then go to Annex 2 and look, can we manufacture this in the US or do we have raw materials that are on the exemption list, right? And by the way, all of this stuff was like this before, right? This is not necessarily something new. When it comes to transfer pricing, we realize, okay, where do we have our legal entities? What is most beneficial for the company? What do we need to commit to the IRS and to the tax structures in the United States in terms of transfer pricing? Because as always in pharma, you manufacture different pieces in different places and you're moving them and distributing them all around, right? So we go this methodically, obviously with a lot of support from experts and advisors. But again, the process is the same. The rules might change here and there. You might need to put manufacturing there or here. Transfer pricing might be handled in a certain way or another. But then we take those decisions pretty much as they've always been taken, to be honest.
Excellent. Sounds like I need to take a little vacation to Switzerland or perhaps Portugal and get a fresh perspective. So, you mentioned, I mentioned unsettling times for biotech. It was a grueling bear market just a few years ago. Are we on the cusp of another? Regulatory environment here in the U.S. is suddenly less predictable than it used to be. Look at Telix last week, Novavax, Immunity Bio this week. I'm curious, as a CEO, what have you learned about leadership since you started this company in this really wild period for biotech since 2021?
I've learned quite a lot. It's hard to pick one. I have to tell you that you introduced the company at the beginning. We were founded in 21 and went public at NASDAQ in 22 in April, which I think was one of the worst days ever for the market. Yeah. So actually, Moonlake has always existed in times of turmoil. After COVID, after all the boom. So we don't know anything else other than a turmoil market, right? But I think one thing that I learned, and you probably sensed it a little bit on the previous points we were discussing, is you really got to chill.
Yeah.
You got to keep it. You got to keep calm. You got to look at the various things. There's a lot of threats always. And the last year it was no M&As and very high interest rates and political turmoil and the next election. And I'm sure next year will be something else. But net, the way we develop the products, the way that we choose what to do on a daily basis doesn't change. But that's understanding the situation from a quote perspective, being able to explain that to your people first, and then try to explain that to the street and place the company in the right moment so that you have all the game in front of you, which is an expression I used before. I think that has been probably the biggest learning. The other learning, I think, is think more broadly than the equity markets, right? And I think you've seen that we've recently announced what I think is a very innovative facility with an investor called Hercules Capital. That brings new sources of cash, and it had never really been done at this scale for a company of our phase, right? So thinking creatively about how to go around all these problems so that, again, you keep the game in front of you and keep calm while looking at it, not passionate or not too passionate, I think has been the learning. I take the FDA as another example. Lots of noise around it. I think the FDA is still full of very, very, very skilled, very, very knowledgeable people. I think the process per se, again, there's ideas, but nothing has really changed. I also see some positive notes on what is the objective. And we haven't seen any difference in our interaction with the FDA, right? So I think that the regulators continue to be a key player, and I think they will do a fantastic job, right? But how do we work together in a changing situation, to me, is far more important than just throw our hands in the air and say the world is over, right? Which I think is what the market has been doing on a weekly basis for the last few months.
Well, those are heartening words, and it's rare for me to get to end one of our podcasts on a positive note. So I think I'm going to leave it right there. Jorge, we look forward to continuing to watch the Moonlake story. We hope to have you back maybe a little later in your journey, and really appreciate you taking the time to join me here on the BioCentury Show.
Jeff and the BioCentury team, thank you for having us.
Excellent.
Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds, returning in 2025 to Chicago, Illinois this June and in Cambridge, UK this September. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore groundbreaking advancements in early-stage R&D and dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Learn more at biocenturygrandrounds.com.